You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Eckott. Britain is, according to the Institute of Race Relations, home to about 2% of the world's asylum seekers. In 2011, the last year for which figures are available, Britain had around 25,000 applicants seeking asylum. But in recent weeks, the government has admitted that many thousands of asylum applications have been lost in some kind of bureaucratic black hole. Part of the reason the Home Secretary Theresa May has now taken back control of the UK border agency. According to the Home Affairs Select Committee, over 60,000 asylum seekers' cases will now have to be closed because the applicants cannot be traced. Meanwhile, the ultra-right-wing British National Party claims there may be almost 500,000 unresolved asylum applications in the UK. Under United Nations Convention, Britain has a duty to offer protection to those in need, and an asylum seeker is anyone who's awaiting an official decision as to whether they can be classified as a refugee. According to the UNHCR, the USA receives the most asylum applications each year, more than 80,000. In Europe, France gets more than double the UK figure, and so does Sweden. According to the UNHCR, the UK's refugee population makes up less than 1% of the overall population. The largest numbers of asylum seekers or refugees come from Pakistan, Iran, Sri Lanka, Nigeria and Syria. The issue of asylum seekers is one on which the media often go to town, with sections of the tabloid press keen to reveal the scale of public expenditure that goes on looking after asylum seekers. Well, joining me now to discuss the concept of asylum and whether Britain is too generous in its treatment of such cases are Stephen Woolfe, Financial Services spokesman for the UK Independence Party, Patrick Lewis, who's a leading barrister at Garden Court Chambers and specialises in immigration and human rights law, and Gavin Hayes, editorial director of the public policy hub Policy Review Intelligence. I'd like to start with you, Gavin. Has the very phrase asylum seeker become a dirty word, or phrase, I should say? When we say asylum seeker now, it's almost taken as implying that it's somebody who doesn't deserve our help, isn't it?
Well, certainly I think that in the context of this discussion, what is greatly needed is an intelligent, informed national debate on the issue of asylum and immigration. All too often we get these rather hysterical headlines on the front pages of newspapers. And I don't think that is necessarily helpful to the sort of debate that, grown-up debate.
And often revolving around the cost, isn't it, of what asylum seekers allegedly cost the UK economy. That's often a main plank of people's worry about this very sensitive term, asylum seeker, and the numbers of people that might represent. Yeah,
sure. And I think one of the figures that we need to emphasise and continue to emphasise is that you alluded to in your opening remarks. The UK is the home to less than 2% of the world's refugees, and yet we are the seventh biggest economy. And we do need to remember that these are people who are often fleeing persecution, fleeing human rights abuses. And so therefore, if we are a civilised society, we should be willing to welcome some of these people to our country.
Let me turn to you, Stephen Woolfe from UKIP. Tell us, what is UKIP's view and position officially on asylum seekers? Do you see them as a burden on the economy?
No, we don't actually, Tim. But going back to your first point, sadly, I think the word has become dirty in some ways. One of the reasons why it has become dirty, sadly, is because although our numbers are relatively low, I mean, it used to be 8,000 who roughly around accepted each year, there was a 3-year period under the Labour government where numbers dramatically increased. I mean, I've been told it was in the region of about 170,000 on average for 3 years. That is where some of the messages got mixed. Thankfully, we've all become sensible and managed to look at the real asylum seekers and deal with immigration. Hopefully, that keeps a lid on those who are extreme on this area.
Patrick Lewis, let me come to you because you're dealing firsthand with people who seek and need asylum or refugee status in this country. Do you come across cases of people who you think patently are trying it on? I mean, why have we got to this stage where people are being labelled scroungers who come here clearly out of great need in the first place?
I mean, of course, there's always going to be an element of people who will fabricate claims in order to be able to gain access to the United Kingdom. But from my own experience, the vast majority of people I've been representing have genuine claims and are individuals who are fleeing persecution or fleeing conditions in their country that has left them no option but to seek refuge abroad. And it is always, from my experience, a decision of last resort rather than the first choice. It's a situation where people are leaving their homes and probably going to have to leave those homes forever. They'll never be able to return. And so those decisions aren't made lightly. But often those individuals who then come to the UK are met with a situation whereby there is a cynicism about their claims amongst the Home Office officials who determine the claims, and even amongst some judges who might hear appeals against the refusals by the Home Office. And that cynicism pervades into the decision-making and can lead to very dangerous results, namely of individuals facing return to countries where they do have a genuine fear.
Paint a picture for us, would you please, Patrick Lewis, as an immigration lawyer representing people who seek asylum and refugee status. How cumbersome or easy a process is it for somebody to come here and say, I'm fleeing persecution, if I go home I'll be killed or put in prison? Take us through the steps. What do you actually do? You turn up at Heathrow Airport and say, I want to claim asylum.
And then once you make that application for asylum, you're put into a screening interview whereby your basic details are taken, the nationality, ethnic group, and the very briefest outline of the reasons why you're claiming asylum. And it's on that basis then you're put into one of two procedures. One is a procedure whereby you'll be given an appointment for an interview, whereby you'll be able to give your story and an explanation as to why you've come to the United Kingdom, and a decision will be made at the end of that interview, potentially with representations made by a lawyer. And then the other procedure is a fast-track procedure. And the fast-track procedure is used for cases which the Home Office consider to be more straightforward, or cases of individuals who are coming from countries which aren't accepted as refugee-producing countries. And that fast-track procedure is the individual is detained throughout the procedure. And it's accelerated in the way that means that the interview takes place very shortly after the person has arrived. A decision is made very shortly thereafter. And if the decision goes against that individual, they have the right to appeal. But again, that decision, the appeal is listed perhaps 2 weeks after or a week after the decision is taken. And that, again, even though it's a faster procedure, can lead to very real injustices taking place because of the accelerated nature, and also because of perhaps even more cynicism within that procedure than the more general procedure whereby people are actually released and have their claims decided whilst in society at large. When you say there's a sort of inbuilt cynicism in the system, I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, a frank disbelief that a country of origin may be somewhere that this person faces persecution? Yeah, I mean, perhaps an example I can give is a case in which I represented myself. It was someone from Afghanistan who claimed to be working with special forces, the American special forces, and operating with them in various missions. He came here on the basis of fear from the Taliban, made an application for asylum. He was interviewed. He wasn't believed due to very minor discrepancies in answers that he gave as to his involvement with special forces. And the solicitor wrote to the Home Office and offered them the opportunity to make inquiries with the Americans that he was indeed with the special forces. The Home Office replied and said, that's for you to do, not for us to do, even though, of course, they would have particular connections with, they would be able to undertake that research. And so the lawyer asked for an adjournment or a delay in the procedure in order that the lawyer could make those inquiries. The Home Office refused that. It went to an appeal. The judge refused to adjourn. The judge refused the claim on the basis of refusing to believe that he was a member of Special Forces. He was very fortunate in that we were able to get another appeal for him. And in that appeal, we were able to prove he had been working with Special Forces. He would be at risk of persecution if he were to be returned, and his appeal was eventually allowed. But there must be many cases which aren't fortunate enough to have the representation that he did. Gavin Hayes, if I could come back to you, how
much do you think the British public are actually worried about this whole business of asylum seekers, the so-called asylum seekers plague, these vast waves of people coming here claiming they want to live in Britain? Is it something that's whipped up by the media, or do you think it is a matter of genuine public concern? There's lots of talk about how much it costs the country to pay for asylum seekers. Some people say £2 million a day or whatever.
I think there is genuine concern, but I think that a lot of that is whipped up by the press, and that's why I said in my opening remarks, I think we need an intelligent and informed debate that's based on the facts, not based on myth. I mean, the charge that it costs a huge amount of money. I mean, asylum seekers do not come to this country to seek benefits. They live on less than £5 a day while their application is being processed. So we need to unravel some of these myths and actually look in detail at what is going on here. And then we need to ensure that the asylum system that we have in place is robust. And so that we avoid some of these problems.
But it would seem like a dangerous social phenomenon if Britain has become famously less tolerant than its reputation would have led people to think it were, some years ago. I mean, Britain has traditionally been a place where people have come seeking a better life, having escaped persecution.
Well, I believe we are a tolerant society, and I think it's why we do need this national debate that's based on the facts, because I think once people learn the facts, they will then make sensible judgments on that. I think the other thing that we also need to be very careful to avoid, and we've avoided it very well in this discussion today, is not mixing up the debate around asylum seekers with the debate around immigration. I think often those two things get very muddied, and that doesn't help in terms of having the discussion on this that we need.
Indeed, muddied waters. Stephen Wolfe, I must come to you as a representative here for UKIP. I mean, your party is often accused of, shall we say, inflaming public opinion about what Britishness is and where we stand in relation to the rest of the world. Do you think UKIP takes any responsibility for that sort of muddying of the waters?
Well, it's as Gavin has said, if some newspapers like to whip up the issues about asylum seekers and mix them up with immigration, there are those on the other side, and I faced it myself, sadly, who also want to mix up what UKIP's policies are on immigration. I want to put it in the context of perhaps my family, for example. My family is a black American, married an Israeli, Jewish, Irish Catholic, and an Englishman. Growing up in Manchester, in Moss Side, where I was born, many people used to call me half-caste, quarter-caste. Now I'm called mixed race. Personally, I'm a member of the human race. So I'm someone here who has come from immigrants into this country, and indeed, growing up in those 80s, I actually faced forms of racism that we don't see necessarily in the community that I lived at the time. So that, in its context, means that when I'm involved in the policy making of UKIP, and there are many others like this, we're very conscious of the tolerance our country has, but we also have to be aware of the need of the community at large and the country at large. And so when we talk about immigration, we have to analyse the facts, which are the numbers, and how it have an impact on education, health, schools, and just social services. I think when I was growing up, we had an average around 30 to 50,000 kind of net migration, whether it's from the West Indies or other countries in Africa or Pakistan and India. The problem during the last 10 years, and particularly under the Labour government, is we've had up to 500,000 a year. And those levels are quite unsustainable in this country. If we want, and many parties have suggested that 70 million is a kind of optimal level that we should be looking at this country, if we continue at those levels, by 2050 we'll be around 85 million people. That is not really sustainable for this nation, because we have to look at the way that we provide food for our inhabitants, water, housing, transport, and all those other costs. So I think that's where the argument comes from. And all that UKIP is trying to do is reflect the concerns from people across the country in different communities are saying, we're already feeling that impact now. How are you, as politicians and policymakers, going to address our concerns about jobs and health and education with these numbers sensibly? And we don't believe that the current policies that we have versus the European Union, which is an open door for anybody coming in from the European Union, Whereas my history and my background means that if you're a non-EU citizen, you're discriminated from coming into the country. We say it should be worldwide, except that everybody has the opportunity to come to the UK, but all on the same system, with a system governed by this country.
But that is conflating immigration and asylum seeking or
Sadly,
refugee status. And
sadly,
why are we at that position? Because as we've heard, it's a tiny number of people who come here fearing for their lives or fearing persecution. And presumably, coming to you, Patrick Lewis, specialising in immigration law, you talked about the two-tier system. Presumably anyone coming from an EU country would have a difficult job convincing the British authorities that they deserved refugee status, wouldn't they?
I would say impossible. I mean, there wouldn't be a sustainable claim made from someone who came from the EU country. And so there wouldn't be a basis. The only way an individual would come to the UK from the EU would be on economic grounds in order to be able to work in the UK rather than through any fear of persecution.
So, coming back to you, Stephen Wolf from UKIP, I mean, why in your answer there do you choose to talk about immigration if we're talking about asylum seekers and Britain having a reputation as a tolerant society, and you yourself, as you say, coming from mixed race heritage, people from different nations and cultures, you presumably see that heritage as a valuable thing. Why are we so fearful of outsiders here?
Well, UKIP isn't fearful of outsiders, and I'm not really sure that the British people are really fearful of outsiders. I think, as we said here in this discussion and in this debate, and when I'm knocking on the doors in all the different districts I've had to over the last couple of years, genuinely, I don't find people fearful of outsiders. What they're simply asking us to do is look at the numbers coming in and ask ourselves to create policies which are more sensible to allow the integration of people coming from different countries into here so that we can adopt slowly and gradually, as we have done quite successfully over the past 30, 40 years, but also fairly. And this is one of my biggest points and one of the reasons why I champion the concept of immigration from the EU being separate and discriminatory to that of the rest of the world. Maybe it's part of my heritage, I don't know. But I actually don't believe we should be treating one sector of the world with all the advantages of being allowed to come here equally, and not treat those from the other parts of the world in the same way. So when you're looking at UKIP policies, our rules are trying to look at a way that we could treat everybody equally, yet deal with the economic impact of immigration and distinguish distinctly from those of the asylum issues. And our policy is very clear that we will continue and enforce the 1951 UN Convention on refugees. We might not necessarily agree with the ECHR, but certainly that is a principle that we would start from.
Just to stay with you for a moment, the Home Secretary has pretty much admitted that the border agency, so-called, has got itself into a complete pickle over many matters and seems to have failed in its duty. What would you like to see happen to the border agency? I mean, obviously, the Home Secretary's been in recent weeks talking very vociferously about the case of Abu Qatada, who probably straddles this issue, doesn't he, in terms of he came here as a legitimate political refugee, but now Britain seems to be wanting to get rid of him because his views don't accord with our ideas of tolerance and how people should behave once they are allowed in.
I think let's look at the UK Border Agency. They were hamstrung in two ways. They were hamstrung firstly by mixed message policy making, in the sense of the way that the Labour government allowed them to have as much immigration coming in and lots more flexibility. Then the Conservatives and Coalition have changed that. And there's never really been a view that we must have a very strong singular policy that treats everybody equally. Secondly, they're hamstrung that they didn't have the relevant numbers. And we're obviously going to face cuts in this country, but during the period when the good days, there just wasn't enough. And we have suggested in UKIP that we need to increase the numbers to 30,000 to be able to handle the backlogs that are involved. Dealing with Abu Qatada is obviously a more complex issue. As a lawyer who believes in human rights, I can fully understand the court's reasoning for wanting to try and enforce laws and principles in place so that it doesn't happen to other individuals in the future who may not be as, in some ways, disreputable as Abu Qatada. He came over legitimately. But what we face in this country with people like Abu Qatada is when we are told that these individuals are a danger, promoting the death and destruction of individuals and organisations, and also promoting something that could be seen to be problematical for the safety of people in this country, and we're not allowed to remove him, that actually sends out a very bad message across the globe. It's so simply, you could stay here and say whatever you like against this country. You can threaten the people, you can cause harm and damage, you can encourage others to commit offences of assault or other violent crimes, but we can't do anything about you. And what does that say to the rest of the people? It sends a very bad message, that in the sense that we can do whatever we like and the government will never get rid of you and we can enforce crime. I don't think that's the right message we should have.
Gavin Hayes, to go back to you, I mean, you've stated very clearly that we mustn't muddy the waters, but is there a basic policy failing here on the part of the government in terms of this confused message? Take the case of Abu Qatada and the way the media has mixed up the idea that too many people coming here may be bad for the infrastructure of this country.
I actually wonder if the whole problem has not got so bad that what we in fact need now is some sort of independent public inquiry, a bit like we had on media standards, that's led by a judge, that's based on the evidence, so that we can have a public airing of all the facts, all the figures, all the evidence, let everyone put their evidence on the table, and then that inquiry should be charged with the responsibility of coming up with practical solutions. And that way, we would have that informed and intelligent national debate that's so clearly urgently needed.
Patrick Lewis, we need to be careful about which judge presided over an inquiry like that, wouldn't we, according to the picture you painted at the start of the conversation, if you say there's a sort of institutional wall to be surmounted when you first apply to be a refugee in this country?
The first tier of the tribunal, there is a varied standard in the judges that sit in that tier. Some are very good and some are not so good, and some do come with preconceived ideas. But I think actually one of the things that we should cherish within this country is the judiciary. The judge who heard the Abu Qatada's appeal, Justice Mitting, is a very experienced judge, and a judge who's not known to be a liberal, but nevertheless heard the evidence and made a decision on the basis of the evidence and on the basis of the law. And it's something that we should be very proud of, I think, in this country, that is still what occurs. Because when there's so many institutions, the BBC, the journalism, politicians that are open to criticism, the one body which seems to be not corruptible is the judiciary. And so I'd be very wary of suggesting that there'd have to be a very careful decision as to which judge is put in charge of such an inquiry. Again, from my experience, certainly at the higher level judges, the standard is extremely high.
Is there a problem, though, in terms of the judiciary and how they satisfy the requirements of British law or English law and the requirements of the European Union?
I mean, again, Abu Qatada's case is an example whereby in this country, in the Second World War, when we were facing annihilation, the authorities had a choice of torturing Nazis who had been captured in order to be able to get information, and they decided not to do that. They were cited by Obama as a reason for trying to overcome this use of torture that the Americans were. And I would suggest it's just a sensible decision based upon values that we have, rather than European values or any other values. They are just simply human values which we should be applying in consideration of cases.
I wonder if you could tell us, working as you do as an immigration lawyer, what do you make of the media frenzy that tends to be worked up about cases like that, but about the issue of asylum in general? In whose interest is it to make this a bugbear for the British public?
I think one of the main problems that we have when we're dealing with asylum seekers and refugees is we forget what we're dealing with is actually human beings, and it becomes a political issue, and one which is one used to simply gain votes rather than acknowledgement that these are individuals who are the most vulnerable in our society, and to target those individuals for political gain is something that we should resist. And Lord Chancellor appointed by Margaret Thatcher, who referred to when judges in the tribunal are dealing with asylum seekers, it's the one remaining court in the land where issues of life and death are still decided. And that is what we're facing when we're dealing with and talking about policies for refugees. And we have to be very cautious then in trying to use a few individuals as a reason to dismantle a system of protection.
Stephen Wolfe from UKIP.
Tim, I was going to say, when we're looking at the system that Patrick has talked about and why there is that interaction between the newspapers and the public, it's because of the failure in many cases of actually being able to, as we say, wheedle out those who are abusing the system and then not being able to get rid of those people from the country. But
how big a problem is that? I mean, it seems to be a rather tiny number of people, and yet we're besieged by stories in the media claiming that Britain is virtually bankrupted by so-called bogus asylum seekers.
That unless you actually look at the system and say, how do you minimise those breaches and therefore give the people the comfort that the system is working properly, then this will always occur, and you'll always get the people saying there's something wrong with the system, we must blame the asylum seeker people. And one of those issues is that connection with immigration, and one of them is the connection with the European Courts of Human Rights. I agree also with Patrick that thankfully, and maybe because I'm biased as a lawyer as well, that we do have a very good judicial system in this country. But when I look across the waters to Europe, and I look at the ECJ, for example, that doesn't have trained lawyers sitting there as justice, as the judiciary as we do here, that you can have a commissioner, that you can have somebody who's simply worked as an administrator making those decisions. I don't have the same level of comfort that perhaps Patrick might have of the judiciary here that I do. So I think we have to look at those decisions, because many of those decisions made in Europe are politically based. It's about ensuring that the European Union stays in its position and its system of justice is pushed out across Europe, and it ignores the well-worn common law system that we've created here.
Gavin Hayes, talking there about wider policy issues. Do you think the government or people who define policy in this country are doing a poor job at getting their message across? You've said several times that we need a clear debate and a rational look at these issues. How does the government get these issues out there, these macro issues, to the people who vote them in on an intelligent level, without it being the waters being muddied by the press, by individual cases which flagrantly do seem to abuse the system? How do you make policy sensible and yet accessible?
I think politicians of all parties do need to be very watchful and careful of the language that they use in this debate. I think politicians of all parties in the past have at times inflamed the debate and sort of used the immigration card to gain votes. I think there is a responsibility of politicians from all parties to move away from that kind of debate. I think clearly the public do have issues and they do have concerns, and it's absolutely right that public policymakers address those concerns, but it needs to be done in a way that is intelligent, that is informed, and doesn't just simply play that immigration card.
Well, I'm afraid our time is up for today. But Gavin Hayes, Editorial Director from Policy Review Intelligence, the Public Policy Hub, thank you for joining us. Patrick Lewis, Barrister at Garden Court Chambers, specialising in human rights law, thank you. And Stephen Wolfe, Financial Services Spokesman for UK Independence Party, thank you too for your time. This is The Voice of Russia from London. Figure, and so does Sweden. According to the UNHCR, the UK's refugee population makes up less than 1/3% of the overall population. The largest numbers of asylum seekers or refugees come from Pakistan, Iran, Sri Lanka, Nigeria and Syria. The issue of asylum seekers is one on which the media often go to town, with sections of the tabloid press keen to reveal the scale of public expenditure that goes on looking after asylum seekers. Well, joining me now to discuss the concept of asylum and whether Britain is too generous in its treatment of such cases are Stephen Wolfe, Financial Services Spokesman for the UK Independence Party. You're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Tim Eckott. Britain is, according to the Institute of Race Relations, home to about 2% of the world's asylum seekers. In 2011, the last year for which figures are available, Britain had around 25,000 applicants seeking asylum. But in recent weeks, the government has admitted that many thousands of asylum applications have been lost in some kind of bureaucratic black hole. Part of the reason the Home Secretary Theresa May has now taken back
these rather hysterical headlines on the front pages of newspapers. And I don't think that is necessarily helpful to the sort of debate that, grown-up debate.
And often revolving around the cost, isn't it, of what asylum seekers allegedly cost the UK economy. That's often a main plank of people's worry about this very sensitive term, asylum seeker, and the numbers of people that might represent.
Yeah, sure. And I think one of the figures that we need to emphasise and continue to emphasise is that you alluded to in your opening remarks. The UK is the home to less than 2% of the world's refugees, and yet we are the seventh biggest economy. And we do...
Patrick Lewis, who's a leading barrister at Garden Court Chambers and specialises in immigration and human rights law, and Gavin Hayes, editorial director of the public policy hub Policy Review Intelligence. I'd like to start with you, Gavin. Has the very phrase asylum seeker become a dirty word, or phrase, I should say? When we say asylum seeker now, it's almost taken as implying that it's somebody who doesn't deserve our help, isn't it?
Well, certainly I think that in the context of this discussion, what is greatly needed is an intelligent, informed national debate on the issue of asylum and immigration. All too often we get
control of the UK Border Agency. According to the Home Affairs Select Committee, over 60,000 asylum seekers' cases will now have to be closed because the applicants cannot be traced. Meanwhile, the ultra-right-wing British National Party claims there may be almost 500,000 unresolved asylum applications in the UK. Under United Nations Convention, Britain has a duty to offer protection to those in need, and an asylum seeker is anyone who's awaiting an official decision as to whether they can be classified as a refugee. According to the UNHCR, the USA receives the most asylum applications each year, more than 80,000. In Europe, France gets more than double the UK.